Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the War Report. And I have to apologize if you can hear my AC in the background. It's far too hot today to do it without it. But we do have quite a bit to cover. I am going to try to keep it as concise as possible. I don't want to repeat myself. And also, because of possible time constraints I might be facing, this may be a bit of a shorter episode. And I did cut down some of the secondary news, where it's really only going to be the Middle East and a Ukraine update today. There isn't much to report elsewhere. There's a few things, there's a few tangential things, but I definitely want to get the big stuff out of the way first, especially with the news out of Iran. I'm recording right now on Sunday, the 22nd of June, 2025, and in the evening, so by the time this is up, it should be a Monday afternoon, and if anything is outdated or any new events that have happened that contradict my current reports and analysis, I apologize. But that is one of the drawbacks to the pre-recorded format. But without further ado, we will get into the big news for today. And as always, I like to give a little bit of a lead up to the actual event. I like to explain the situation beforehand. And I want to start with a follow up on the strikes from this past week between Iran and Israel, in which both have dealt quite a striking blow on each other. The Iranians, at this point, I believe the most recent number I saw, have launched 20 rounds of strikes against Israel. This includes the strikes that took place after the American strike on Iran that occurred last night, as the night of recording, the night of the 21st morning of the 22nd. But that's not to say the Israelis have not done their fair share of damage. Now, when you compare the two, the Iranians, in terms of manpower, in terms of resources, in terms of what it can tolerate, they have a lot more they can lose. They can tolerate higher losses. And if we're talking about a game of attrition, the Iranians have the edge. It is that simple. But the video footage coming out of Israel in particular, and perhaps I'm looking at biased sources, perhaps I am being a little one-sided about this, and if that is the case, I apologize. But it does seem just every few hours like there's a new video out of Tel Aviv and Haifa in particular, where a new building is just getting hit, a new site is just getting hit. Iranian missiles are raining down with little to no resistance on the Israeli side, and that their air defenses seem exhausted. And so far, we've seen them hit ministry buildings, we've seen them hit military sites. They've actually even hit uh, the Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv. And I do find it interesting that Jerusalem is the so-called capital of Israel, yet all of their important ministries and buildings do seem to be in Tel Aviv. But that really is aside the point. And similar to Ukraine, what has happened in Israel during this is that the Knesset has forbidden Israeli civilians, and of course military personnel, this was already in place for OPSEC reasons, but they've forbidden anyone in Israel to post pictures of missile strikes, even damages from the missiles, where it is a cover-up operation, because they want to claim the Iron Dome is 100% successful, or I suppose in this case, the Arrow and David's sling systems are 100% successful. The Iranians are just firing bottle rockets at us, completely impotent, will exhaust their missile supply, and then, of course, Trump and the Americans can come in and finish the job with the Iranians. And perhaps given last night's strikes, that's not an unreasonable position for Israel to take. And I'll get into some of the reasons I think the timing of the strike, the way it was carried out, and the more question of why behind it, beyond just the surface level, of course, in just a little bit here. Um, but not to play into too much sensationalist news. One of the reports I saw during this past week of fighting between Iran and Israel is that commercial flights to and from Israel are impossible under current conditions. The skies are simply too dangerous. But there is an uptick in reports of sea vessels, particularly yachts, leaving from Israel to Cyprus. And that is not a surprise if these reports are confirmed to be true. Israelis have a long history of going to Cyprus. In fact, there's actually some pretty infamous cases even recently of, let's just say, what IDF soldiers do with or to the locals more appropriately in Cyprus. There's some, let's just say they don't go very far to dispel stereotypes. That's as far as I will say. But in terms of news coming out from the Cyprus side, I haven't seen any major reports of Israelis showing up by the boatloads and taking refuge in Cyprus. The ones with money, the ones with the means to escape, probably are taking that route, or the ones who are trying to just get out by any means necessary are probably trying to get to Cyprus, and then they can catch a flight out of the region and go wherever, whether that's to their cousins in New York or Florida or London, Berlin, Paris, all the usual place. Once again, we're talking about the largest diaspora group probably in the world at this point. Half of them live outside of Israel in terms of those belonging to that certain ethno-religious group. So these people, by and large, have connections in other countries. Many of them hold two, if not more, passports themselves. So there's ways out for them. And amid all the chaos, there were some interesting reports of a little bit of a reprioritization on the part of the IDF, where they have withdrawn the Elite 98th from the Gaza Strip and shifted it towards the border with the Jordanians, and also has shifted it north towards Lebanon, where the operations in the Gaza Strip, it's still ongoing. Hamas has not been rooted out of the Gaza Strip. Most of what's been happening in the Gaza Strip has been just a campaign of total war, which has mostly impacted civilians. This isn't anything new, especially not on the part of our greatest ally in the Middle East. But they are shifting troop positions. Perhaps they feel Hamas is weakened enough to the point where it can't mount a successful counterattack against Israeli positions. That's also on top of the larger concerns, but in terms of units they could pull from, that does seem strange. And I do think it goes to show how overextended Israel is, because we're talking about deployments in Syria, deployments that are still in the Gaza Strip. They didn't withdraw all their force from the Gaza Strip. And then, of course, along the West Bank and Jordanian borders. And that's also on top of their missile and air forces that are poised to attack the Iranians right now. And everyone wants to talk about how these are great wins for Israel and how Israel has benefited so much from October 7th. And while I do think the idea of a so-called stand-down operation, the fact that there were people within the Israeli government who saw the advantage of a situation that would justify, at least to the Israeli public and to their American backers, total war, it does seem that they've put themselves in an even strategically worse position than before. Perhaps they have a little bit of buyer's remorse in Syria, where Bashar al-Assad is now gone, and that's after he somewhat distanced himself from the Iranians back in 2020, 2021. Now they have to deal with the divided Syria, well, where Jolani will roll over to really any demand that the Israelis give him. There still is the question of Turkey, and it's, I guess you could say, love-hate relationship with Israel. There's the question of Hezbollah, which did suffer its own decapitation strikes back last fall, but once again is still an operable organization. It's still an organization with thousands, if not tens of thousands, of rockets at its disposal that could be launched against Israel really at any point. There's the perpetual thorn in the side of the Houthis, which have seemed to be the most resilient of these, I guess you could say, Iranian-aligned, if not Iranian-backed, militant groups across the region, while there have been Israeli airstrikes in Yemen, it hasn't been to a great degree of success. Of course, the Americans pulled out, and now as a result of the current actions, the Houthis are saying they will begin firing on American vessels again. And even before Operation True Promise 3, as the Iranians would call it, the Houthis were still regularly landing hits in Israel. And that's going to continue. They have the missile technology to do so. And what it does look like right now on the part of Iran and its allies is they want to break the confidence that the world and also the Israeli population have in Israel. Returning to my previous point of them having likely multiple citizenships and means to escape the country, at the first sign of trouble, a lot of these people are going to disappear. A lot of these people are going to leave. I don't have I don't think they've published exact immigration numbers since the October 7th attacks, but I would be very interested in see those. I would guess that tens, if not hundreds of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands is the absolute high end, but I could see tens of thousands of Israelis having left the country since October 7th. Keep in mind, it is only a nation of 8-9 million people, pushing towards 9 million people. So the charge of hundreds of thousands is probably a bit on the extreme end. But I could easily see a situation where you've had a few 10,000 leave. I mean, you already have at this point internally displaced Israelis, 60,000 from northern Israel, from when the conflict with Hezbollah was still at its height, just before the so-called decapitation strikes. And that is one thing. It has relieved some pressure on Israel, but Hezbollah is still arguably the dominant political force in Lebanon. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see action from them soon, especially depending on how much more these attacks are going to escalate. Because as it stands now, I know it's only been just over a week. There's no end in sight, as far as I can see. But I guess a little humor surrounding the whole situation, if you want to look at it this way, is that Israeli air defenses are being depleted at a rapid rate. And some estimates say, now these I think are a bit alarmist, and of course it would serve the interest of Israel to put out these sort of alarmist statements, or Israeli aligned factions to put out these alarmist statements, that they have air defenses the last 2 weeks before the Iranians can really hit them with impunity. I think that's probably an exaggeration. I think that is to foment a sense of urgency that isn't there, of course, to drive greater support to Israel in a much faster manner. But what is interesting is that the U.S. is withdrawing air systems from Ukraine in order to move them to bases in the Middle East. Now, they didn't say they're giving them directly to Israel, but the direct quote from Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense: "I've been at congressional hearings all week. I was asked the question, have you really moved counter-drone systems from Ukraine to the Middle East? I said yes, we have. We are using all available means to protect our people in the region and all around the world, because today's defense landscape is different. Small systems can pose a serious threat. We are as prepared as possible. War's really changing before our eyes. The technology, the methods, it's scary. Yes, it's scary, but we have the right people on the ground." And Zelensky is not thrilled about this. I'll get into some of Zelensky's reactions to, let's just say, the reprioritization of American military force in a little bit here. But moving on to the immediate lead up to these strikes, we had accusations from the Iranian Foreign Minister Arakchi, who was the primary Iranian representative of the talks with the U.S., who was frequently meeting with Witkoff, was scheduled at the sixth round of talks. He alleges, which is probably accurate, that the Americans were heavily involved in the prior Israeli strikes. And that he does not believe Trump's claims of not being involved, and he wants an explicit public message. Any sort of private communication or uh, very quiet weasel way of getting out of it is not acceptable to Arachi, as he was saying, and that he wants the U.S. to quote unquote publicly distance himself from this conflict. Now, as far as I know, the Iranians are no longer entertaining the notion of talks. I would be surprised if they were at this point, because it's completely off the rails. What more can you what more can you say about that? It is there's no recourse to be had. If you look at the original attack, and you can go back to my episode last week if you want more context for that, the scale of the attack would have been impossible, even assuming Israel had everything else at its disposal, even assuming Israeli air forces and missile forces were completely prepared for this attack. Without American logistics, and in particular American ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, this attack would not have been possible at all. And like I said, that's not even including the fact that you probably had American fueling aircraft overhead. You probably had the use of American military facilities in the region, particularly over Iraqi airspace and within the country of Iraq, because as it stands now, it has become an operating base for the Israelis. Now, what was surprising is, at least publicly, the Azeris have denied being involved in any sort of attack against Iran. They've denied being a staging ground. They've denied providing Israel any sort of airspace or resources to conduct this attack. Now, it would be in their own interest to say that. Whether that's true or not, that's to be determined. But I actually do believe it. Of course, Iran and Azerbaijan are rather hostile towards each other. Israel and Azerbaijan are very friendly, even though the Azeris are trying to at least publicly distance themselves from the Israelis a little in light of the recent bout of tensions. But such a provocative move from Azerbaijan, I simply don't see it at this point, even with how entrenched they are with the Israelis. So I do tend to believe that claim, and that most of these attacks did cross through Syrian, Iraqi, and Jordanian airspace. And the Arab states, particularly the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, have been more than willing to participate in missile defenses and anti-air defenses. Same with the Jordanians for Iranian missiles and drones heading towards Israel. And I suppose, and I'll get into it later, it does renew the question of the reconciliation talks that are ongoing between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which have seen great progress to this point. And is it possible that this is going to be the point at which it falls apart? It very well could be, depending on the outcome of this recent bout of tensions, or I suppose if you want to go as far as say this war, which yes, it is a war. These are countries actively engaged in military combat against each other, but how long is that going to last? I think that is the $1,000,000 question. But getting more so into the particulars of the attack and the direct lead up to the attack, there was the so-called 2-week deadline where the U.S. was moving more military assets into the region, that Trump was going to have everything in position and wait 2 weeks before deciding to take any action. And that was announced on Saturday the 21st. The same night the attack took place, and I'll get into why we now know that was a complete ruse in just a moment here. But they were shifting carriers around. You had the USS Nimitz en route, and it still is en route to the Gulf, in which this is expected to be its last deployment before it is retired. So some would say perhaps this is a Gulf of Tonkin incident in the making, that they might sacrifice a piece on the chessboard, as it were, in order to further their own ends. It's very possible. But it's expected to link up to the Gerald Ford, and then, after a transition period, relieve the Ford of its duties while it returns to refuel, resupply, R&R, the basic rotations that they do. And what preceded, or proceeded, I should say, the announcement of the 2 week deadline was the evacuation of diplomatic personnel from the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and the U.S. Consulate in Tel Aviv. Which, when you get these sort of military evacuations, you also got them from American bases throughout the region, such as the American military positions in Bahrain and Qatar, which are both well within the Gulf. And it does look like the Americans are getting their assets out of the Persian Gulf, at least temporarily. Probably an expectation for the Iranian mining of the Strait of Hormuz, which I'll talk about the likelihood of that and the implications of that once we get past some of the major news of the attack here. But there was a real split in Trump's cabinet when it came to engaging these attacks. And we saw what side won last night, that it came down. Trump did authorize these strikes. But in the lead up to it, there were some disputes. The primary voice that was going around was reports from Tulsa Gabbard. Now, these were from February, March, where she was giving her intelligence reports as Director of National Intelligence to Congress, saying that the Iranians at this point are not pursuing the construction of a nuclear bomb. And you do have to recall, now there's other elements at play here, but at least publicly facing, Tulsa Gabbard has been the foreign policy skeptic, has been rather adored by many on the so-called populist right because of her positions. Went to Syria to meet with Assad, has taken a sane and measured line on the Russians previously. This was back during her time in Congress and during her brief presidential run back in, 2019, 2020. And now she comes out and puts a statement. This was done via Twitter, or X if you prefer. The dishonest media is intentionally taking my testimony out of context, spreading fake news as a way to manufacture division. America has intelligence that Iran is at the point where it can produce a nuclear weapon within weeks to months if they decide to finalize the assembly. President Trump has been clear that that can't happen, and I agree. My full testimony below. Now, some people might consider this a pivot from her previous positions, and here's just the exact text of that on the screen for those of you who would like to read it. However, you have to recall, when there was the operations against the Houthis, she maybe wasn't as eager as, say, somebody like Hegseth or Mike Waltz, but was more than willing to accede to the operation and say that it, and give justification for it, say that it has to be done. And then, I would say more interestingly, from the White House, the other alleged voice of dissent, and he's been walking on both sides of the aisle with this, is J.D. Vance, the vice president, where, if you recall, once again back to the Houthi strike, he was reluctant but accepted the quote-unquote necessity of doing so, so long it was a quote-unquote one-off strike. And he was, let's just say he didn't look pleased last night at Trump's address that he gave at 10 p.m. from the White House. And I don't know, perhaps I'm reading too much into facial expressions, but he has been saying for the past few weeks that, of course, the Americans are not seeking a war with Iran. We want to negotiate, blah, 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 blah. And then he comes out today after these attacks saying, we were glad it's a one-off, and, we're not at war against Iran, just Iran's nuclear program, and that we were just looking to destroy their nuclear program because no enriched uranium is needed on the Iranian side. So very much trying to sugarcoat the poison pill, as it were. He is the guy they're going to trot out in order to make it okay, in order to say, look, it was just a one-time thing we had to do. This isn't going to be a sustained campaign. We're not going to get drawn further into the region. This isn't going to be another forever war. And frankly, I don't believe it. This is A/B testing, and I think probably the only figure I could believe that had any sort of genuine opposition to these strikes was probably Witkoff, and even that's a bit of a stretch. And now, I discussed last episode, Witkoff was cautioning against Iran's military capabilities, and you could read that one of two ways. Once again, was he saying that we have to act now because the Iranian missile program is too powerful, or we have to take caution with our moves because the Iranians have the capability to deal damaging blows to Israel, which we have seen is the case. And Witkoff, of course, being of a certain ethnic background himself, does have an interest in the preservation of Israel. However, I would say not to praise him too much, but I do think there is some room here. Um, I do think with Witkoff, what we could see is somebody who does recognize the reality of the situation, even if he is a Zionist himself. He actually realizes this is a far worse position for Israel to be in than having some sort of ramshackled agreement with the Iranians. And I would agree. Ironically enough, despite my personal views, effectively my position, effectively the position of the, I guess you could say, foreign policy skeptics in this case, regardless of their opinion of Israel, is effectively more pro-Israel because our position would not result in the Israelis having Iranian missiles raining down upon them. And like I said, I could go on about my views on the subject all day. I'm going to spare you. I've done it many times before. But if I'm going to try to argue with a brick wall, uh, just go along with it, uh, does this rabid pro-Israel crowd not understand that what they are doing has probably created the greatest security crisis for the state of Israel since its inception in 1948? I would argue that at this point, with the way the pieces are on the proverbial chessboard, this is as bad as, say, the 1948 war. This is as bad. This is the worst position I think that they have been in since their founding, and we're rapidly closing the window where the Americans are not going to be able to bail them out, no matter what they do. Even if they have all the willpower in the world, they will simply not have the means to bail out the Israelis. And to get to the last point here, with Trump's demand before these strikes happened, he was demanding the quote unquote unconditional surrender of Iran, a nation that we are not at war with by any means. Now, you could argue after these airstrikes, we are in a state of war with the Iranians, and I think there's a very real case to be made for that. But we're not talking about any sort of existing military authorization or any sort of new military authorization that would lead to a scenario where the Americans would demand the unconditional surrender of the Iranians, unless, of course, they mean to capitulate to the Israeli demands, which is almost certainly what they actually mean by it. And, of course, we're saying that on Israel's behalf because although the American military is greatly degraded, if there's anyone with firepower to back it up, it's going to be us and not the Israelis. But the last point I'll touch on before talking about the actual operation itself is Arachi, the Iranian foreign minister, met with various European leaders. The regular cast of characters, particularly the foreign ministers of France, Germany, UK, I think Kaya Kallas as well, the EU foreign minister as well. And these brave truth tellers, these charters of a new course for a new power bloc of liberal European democracies vis-a-vis the insane orange tyrant across the Atlantic. Well, what they did is they went and parroted the exact line that the United States and Israel have been saying. Uh, they may want to talk about how different they are from Trump and how Trump isn't really the leader of the free world, and that responsibility now falls on the shoulders of, I don't know, Macron or I almost called him Schultz, Friedrich Merz, or Ursula von der Leyen. While that burden might fall on their shoulders now, maybe their collective shoulders. It seems like they couldn't be bothered to break with American policy when it really counts. Very similar to a lot of the Ukraine issue. When you go back to, say, even the Biden administration. Now, I know Biden was an out-and-out Atlanticist, as opposed to Trump, who more so drags his heel on the issue and is more demanding of the Europeans. But when it comes to these strategic autonomy types, these Macron types, whenever they have the opportunity to really assert themselves, assert the Europeans as an independent power bloc that doesn't need any guarantees from the U.S. and can have its own voice on the world stage, what do? They parrot the exact line coming from Tel Aviv and Washington. And we all know why. And I know that people have been talking about the Trump-Bibi split, and I do think there's some conversation to be had about that. I want to get into that in just a moment. But you have to wonder, was the Macron-Bibi split that we saw over the past few weeks, was that a fake too? Or is that just how strong the continuity of policy is on both sides of the Atlantic, that no matter what personal feuds the heads of state or heads of government of these countries might have, the establishments, the so-called deep states, the swamps in these respective countries are so aligned that, barring any sort of, I use this term in the most abstract sense, of course I'm not advocating for anything, the most revolutionary change, then things are going to continue on as planned. But to get into the meat and potatoes, the operation itself, which I know that you've all been waiting with bated breath on this one, so I'll keep you waiting no longer. The Pentagon gave its report of the operation. So, in brief, this came from Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, press briefer this morning with the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And this was Hegseth's statement saying that the Iranian nuclear ambitions have been, quote-unquote, obliterated by U.S. airstrikes. The mission's not a target Iranian troops or put civilians in harm's way. Now, as far as I know, there were no other attacks on military targets, nor were there attacks on civilians, that it was a precise strike against the nuclear facilities of Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. And he also said that the mission was not, it has not been about regime change. Keep that in mind, we'll touch on that later. And then shifting over to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, who got more into the finer details of the operation. The U.S. used 7 B-2 bombers, and these launched from Missouri, spent an estimated 36 to 40 hours in constant flight with rotating crews of 2, and as well as all, I mean, these things are huge, all the amenities on board, where they were able to carry out a 40-hour operation with the given resources, and that from these bombers, more than 24 cruise missiles were used to attack the Iranian nuclear facilities in Isfahan. That also included submarine launches from undisclosed locations in the waters near Iran. The claim, the Pentagon says, is that there were 75 precision-guided munitions attacks against the Iranians, and that there were no fighter scrambles, nor were there any air defense systems activated by the Iranians, and that the Pentagon is anticipating and is prepared for Iranian retaliation against forces in the region. And I think broadly, the Pentagon is, I don't want to say telling the truth because I don't want to give them that much credit, but is broadly giving a realistic overview of the situation. And I'll go into some more details that we have about the attack, just a basic timeline. And that is, around 1 a.m., the Israeli drones activated air defenses against several Iranian regions. There were fighter jets over Shiraz in Iran. Several aircraft around 1:22 a.m. Were heard over central Iran. Around 2:04 a.m., 2 bombers and explosion were heard near Qom, which is the site of the Fordo nuclear site. 2:13 a.m., an explosion was near Kashan, another city near Fordo. 2:38 a.m., an explosion was heard at Fordo, but it was assumed to be a drone intercepted, which was proven wrong. At 2:41 a.m., there was a loud explosion heard at Isfahan Atomic Energy Facility. 2:46 a.m. an explosion was heard at Nanance, and 2:55 a.m. GPS jamming was observed across Iran. And as it stands now, the claim from the Pentagon, the claim from U.S. officials, is that the Iranian nuclear program has been just obliterated. The Iranians are never going to build a nuke now until we have to relitigate this issue in 2 months, and that they actually rebuilt their program, and that we need to conduct another precision strike in order to take out the Iranian nuclear threat. Now, to put some context to this, I'm going to show um, the damage to Fordo that was captured by satellite imagery. And these were satellite images from the 22nd of June 2025. You can see what they suspect to be munition holes and the tunnel entrances that have been sealed off. However, there are some interesting counter reports that the satellite images as of June 20th and June 21st suggest these entrances were sealed off beforehand. And I'll go ahead and pull those maps in just a moment. So if you look at the left-hand image, this is Fordo on the 20th. Right-hand image, yeah, forgive me for low resolution, but these are the best I could get. This is Fordo on 6/21, and if you turn your attention back to the right, back to the left, excuse me, this is Fordo on 6/22. To compare to the original strike, let me just go ahead and get that one up here. You can see, yes, the damage here, and I'll put that one side by side with the other 6/22 satellite imagery that we have. Hopefully this is visible, and I'll put it that way without the zoom in, but as it looks now, it does look to me, perhaps I'm wrong, that the entrances were already blocked off and that this strike accomplished a whole lot of nothing except making the Israelis feel good. Now, I do have some breaking reports that perhaps this was down to a DEI hire, because one of the 14 pilots involved on this B-2 bomber mission was a woman. In which case, I think that's stunning and brave. I think that is wonderful. But I was also promised by Donald Trump that we were putting the woke away, and that we were no longer going to have these diversity hires or whatever, ruining our military capabilities. I'm just saying, a man would have gotten the job done. But you see, even when they put the woke away, they can't put the woke away. That's the fate that we're stuck with. Now, as for what is arguably more important, the reactions to these strikes, it has been across the board, all over the place. So perhaps the most important reaction is that Netanyahu said it was, quote, a bold decision to target Iran's nuclear facilities, that with the awesome and righteous might of the United States, that they'll change history, that Israel thanks them, and the forces of civilization thanks Donald Trump for ordering this operation against the Iranian nuclear program, and that the most dangerous regime in the world will not have access to the most dangerous weapons in the world. More or less verbatim Netanyahu's words regarding the situation at hand, which I don't think should surprise anyone, and that he was just overjoyed when it came to the outcome of this operation. Now, that hasn't stopped further Israeli strikes on Iran. It certainly has not stopped further Iranian strikes on Israel. Which, returning to my other question, is this going to be a one-off operation on the part of the United States that claimed it was not seeking regime change? Or is this going to be a sustained campaign whenever the Israelis have any inkling that the Iranians have a new nuclear facility, that maybe we didn't quite finish the job last time, or they know the location of Iranian missile launchers, that we're going to have American strikes on Iran on a repeated basis? And I think it's very possible. It's too soon to say But I think it's very possible that this does metastasize into a sustained campaign. And perhaps I'm putting too much stock in a so-called Truth Social post, but just on the 22nd, the day after these strikes, this is what Trump put out on his Truth Social account. It is not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be a regime change? MEGA. MEGA, MEGA, MEGA. I should probably stop saying that. That sounds too close to another term that may get me banned. But that stands for Make Iran Great Again, apparently. I could think of another I that it could possibly mean, that could possibly fit the acronym. But what do I know? But as it stands, the Iranian regime, to use the terminology of Donald Trump and many others, does seem to be standing strong. And that any sign of defection is non-existent. They can peddle out Reza Pahlavi, or whatever his name is, the so-called dispossessed Iranian crown prince, onto Fox News, and he can pull the world's largest Nigerian prince scam on the American population above 55. He could do that. But as it stands, there are rumors of some cadre of Iranian military officers willing to stage a coup and install him while he celebrates the bombing of his quote-unquote country. That doesn't look like it's going to be the case. And that across all walks of life, I mentioned this last episode, the Iranians have united. That there has been a massive rally around the flag effect. Even among the diaspora, who are pretty infamous for despising the Iranian government. It does look like they've won their support again. That there are very few Iranians, either at home or abroad, who are actually supporting these operations, and that, as it stands now, the people are with the government. Which I suppose is the biggest irony of this all. Because had we stayed the course, even going all the way back to 2018, back to Iran Deal 1.0, had Trump stayed the course, and had he sat down the Israelis and explained to them, or had somebody in the State Department, or somebody in the Pentagon, or whoever, sit down to the Israelis and explain to them that if we just stay the course with the Iranians, if we maintain the Iran deal, the more we pry open Iranian society, the weaker its government will become. Unlike a lot of other countries, the Iranians are not... Let me put it this way. Unlike a lot of other countries, it's not like Russia or China, where the government, I would say, enjoys a decent amount of support from the population. And we're talking about pre-war conditions of Iran, where one could genuinely believe, even if the numbers are padded out, that Putin probably does have the tacit approval of, at least tacit approval of 3/4 of the Russian population, or that Xi Jinping and the Communist Party of China probably do enjoy a rather healthy approval rating. I don't think that was the case in Iran, especially post-2009, after the color revolution that they attempted in Iran, where many of the educated class, the urban educated class, had their qualms with the Islamic Republic and did not necessarily support the Islamic Republic. And I'm not saying that means they were all these women who want to get half naked in the street and get beaten up by the morality police. That's a different case entirely. But the people who were tired of the ossified leadership of Islamic legalism. And we even saw that with, number one, the election of Pezeshkian, who ran as a reformer. Number two, the very loose enforcement of, say, morality laws within Iran. You see some of the street pictures, especially now after these strikes. The women especially are not in Islamic dress code, and nothing is happening to them. It does lead me to believe that the so-called hijab protest that you get every other year for a few years there were a bit exaggerated because although, like I said, these Iranian laws are on the books, and while they were enforced to some degree, I don't think they ever held that much weight in the population, in at least in recent years, at least since the 2010s. That Iran as a society, maybe not in the terms of Western liberalism, but was liberalizing nonetheless, and had, I guess you could say, they just trusted the plan with the Iran deal. They would have slowly eroded support, and that at a certain point, the Islamic Republic probably would have atrophied in a color revolution, much like, say, Yanukovych's government in Ukraine, which uh, you could say about a lot about Yanukovych, but I think the reason why Ukraine turned out the way it did is because he was not a resolute leader. He was not somebody willing to take the pro-Russian stance. He just wanted a return to the status quo, where can't we all just get along before he was eventually forced to flee the country, being branded a Russian asset, despite the fact that had he been a Russian asset, much of what happened in Ukraine probably would not have happened in the first place. But much like Yanukovych, I could envision a scenario where if Trump, for whatever reason, caved and was able to convince the Israelis to stay the course in the Iran deal, that even with all the provisions, by the time the 10-year provision were up in the Iran deal, which would have been 2025, the Islamic Republic would have either been a shell of its former self or would have been toppled in a color revolution, which I do think was the plan, that they wanted to really wage the war of soft power against Iran. And leading into this year, what I thought is a similar campaign would have happened, especially when Trump went into diplomacy. I figured it was a soft power campaign that they were going to wage against the Iranians because they realized that direct military confrontation would be too costly and too politically controversial. But I suppose I was wrong on that point. I can admit it. But what is the supreme irony of all of this is that they have accomplished the exact opposite. And had they stuck to the course, many of the Iranians who were growing frustrated with the Islamic Republic would have maintained their political views and would have been perhaps agents of change, even if that was a more Western-oriented change. And they might have even seen Netanyahu. I don't want to go this far, but there's a possibility many of them could have seen Netanyahu as uh, their advocate, as it were, their liberator, if he did not fire shots into Iran. And that's discounting, say, the strikes against Haniyeh, who was a Palestinian negotiator, which still was a blatant violation of Iranian sovereignty, especially at the inauguration of Pezeshkian. But I think a lot of them probably could have overlooked that because they didn't assassinate an Iranian official. But now that they're bombing Iranian cities that are having collateral damage, now that they are outright showing that we don't care what you do, we want a war, we want regime change, and that this whole nuclear program, now especially now that we have Trump's own words, let me just reference that again. This whole denuclearization program shows that it was all a ruse. That the ultimate goal is there cannot be a country that is strong enough to challenge Israeli interests, even if it is friendly with Israel. If it's not on a leash like, say, the Gulf states, then it cannot be allowed to stand, or on a leash like Egypt, then it cannot be allowed to stand. And that it doesn't matter what the governing ideology is. It could be an Islamic republic, it could be an Islamic monarchy, it could be a secular dictatorship. Think Bashar al-Assad, Saddam Hussein. But regardless, no matter what it is, if Israel could see it as a potential threat, then it would be eliminated. And believe me, there will become a point, and there probably will come a point, where they will apply this outside of the region. If there's any country, and not that Europe has much sovereignty on its own, if there's any country in Europe that, say, they feel is a threat to them, or North Korea, because of their relationship with the Iranians, they could feel that as a threat to them, then, yeah, they're going to take these brazen actions while they still can. And like I said, that's a very narrow window, which I do think is beginning to close. But when it comes to the question of regime change in Iran, the question is, would it work, and is it even possible? Because they want to apply the formula that they applied to. I think the particular examples that come to mind are Syria, Iraq, and Libya, all of which had their own WMD programs, all of which disarmed, and none of which have those same men who gave them those programs in power today. Only one of which, one of those men survived because Assad was swept off to Russia before his regime collapsed. But they want to apply that same model to the Iranians. And in all of this, I suppose you could say the lesson that has been taught by these American actions that American diplomacy has no credibility, especially not after last night. And it was already on the rocks, and some might argue that its diplomatic credibility was already shot beforehand. Because, like I said, we could go through the numerous examples where Gaddafi disarmed and he was assassinated in a very brutal manner. Saddam disarmed and 400,000 American troops showed up in his country, put him on a kangaroo court, and had him publicly hanged. Assad disarmed, and he also distanced himself from the Iranians. He capitulated to many demands, and now he's living in exile, returning to his practice as an eye doctor while his country burns the ground. I mean, even just today there were reports of another bombing attack in another historical church in Syria under Giuliani's government. Giuliani's government that promised religious plurality and freedom of worship and all that tripe they always throw out when they want to prove themselves moderate. I guess you can negotiate with terrorists when they serve your own interests. Giuliani being a former Al Qaeda man means nothing to these people. But I digress. But on the other hand, you look at North Korea, which engaged in talks to the United States, refused to disarm, and now is being reopened to the global community. Maybe not in its entirety, maybe they are still severed from negotiations with the West, but they've successfully restored relations with the Russians to the point where they have a mutual defense pact. Don't mind the temporary co-host here. Where they have a mutual defense pact, where they have decent relationship with China. They are starting to be included in more of, I guess you could say, the BRICS world. And also, with the new administration in South Korea, have the possibility of real unification talks to take place again. And in all this, Trump still has the gall to say he wants to meet with Kim Jong-un again. What reason does Kim Jong-un have to meet with Donald Trump again? Admittedly, in 2017, 2018, North Korea was isolated. They didn't really have that much support from Russia or China, both of which maintained a decent but distant relationship with them. But ever since then, they've shown that having nukes is a path to sovereignty. That you will not bring down the hammer of American power, the Operation Midnight Hammer, as they called this recent one, if you have that deterrent established on your own. India and Pakistan have proven much the same, that they are harder to press when it comes to these more absurd demands because they are both nuclear armed states. And let me just say for the record, I trust the Iranians with nuclear weapons more than I trust the Indians and the Pakistanis combined. If there were a hypothetical where I could transfer every nuclear asset from Iran and Pakistan, India and Pakistan combined to Iran, I would feel the world would actually be a safer place if those were in the hands of the Iranians. And I mean, look at what just happened with India and Pakistan just last month, about 6 weeks ago. They came to the brink. They went into another skirmish that could have very easily escalated. But on that same note, you have the Iranians receiving guarantees from the Pakistanis, or I suppose you could say guarantees is a bit of a strong word, but receiving support from Pakistan where they may extend their nuclear umbrella to Iran because Pakistan, love or hate them, they see the implications of the actions that have taken place right now. And I think everyone has. And that American diplomatic credibility is shot, not only in the Middle East, but worldwide. Why should China engage in good faith trade talks with the United States? Why should Russia trust the Americans as neutral arbiters? Not that they were neutral in the Ukraine conflict in the first place. Heading into the Istanbul talks, which those are dead in the water themselves. Those aren't coming back. And that in just one night, and I suppose you could say it was a build-up, but in just one night, the Americans had the most blatant example of why they have no diplomatic credibility. And what are the ramifications it's going to be? It was bad enough under Biden. Now Trump has really, in my opinion, put that final nail in the coffin. And how are we supposed to come back from that? Well, what are we supposed to do? And that brings into question some other topics with that. With the Gulf states, what direction are they going to take? Are they going to bide their time, wait this out, and see who's the stronger party at the end? But once again, what's to stop, say, Saudi Arabia or the Emiratis or the Qataris especially, because the Qataris have been in the crosshairs of, let's just say, American Zionist interest, especially after Tucker Carlson and Steve Witkoff going to Iran and the alleged gift of the Air Force One to the Americans from Qatar. What's to stop a similar fate from befalling any of them, even if it's completely fabricated? What if there's rumors of, say, a Saudi nuclear program because we want regime change there, or a Qatari nuclear program because we want regime change there? I think what we've shown is that we'll fabricate any evidence, no matter how flimsy, in order to conduct these sort of operations. So at this point, what reasons do the Gulf states have to continue their backdoor relationship with the Israelis? And like I said, what reason does any serious player have to take the American Secretary of State or the American President at his word when it comes to these crises? I know that Pakistan, I suppose it was before this, nominated Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize because of his mediation efforts when it came to India and Pakistan. But there's these are not the diplomatic behaviors of a great power. If you think America should be a great power, if you want to make that argument, fair enough, then this is not how it conducts itself. That there's no honor, there's no keeping to its word. And then, look, I understand that other countries would stab their friends and foes in the back alike if it was convenient to them. But there's a certain level of tact you have to exercise. When you have to execute a betrayal of that kind, when you do have to go back on your word, it is something that requires very careful planning, and it's a very delicate process. And like I said, it is the nature of empire. It is something that's eventually going to happen. But this is just brazen. This is just Trump swinging around a hammer and just being very brash about it. You know what I hope we see at some point? I hope we see Trump at a UN meeting banging his shoe against the table. I think that would be the perfect imagery for the American empire. That, you know, it was clownish when Khrushchev did it, admittedly, yes, but we need an American official to recreate the Khrushchev moment at the UN, just slamming his shoe on the table. Next time an Iranian or Russian or Chinese delegate is speaking before the UN. We have to make it come full circle. Mike Waltz, I think he's still on to become the UN rep. He just start slamming his shoe on the table. Somebody has to do it. We need to recreate the moment, but that's effectively all American diplomacy at this point. Like I said, something that Khrushchev was a laughingstock for back in the 50s and 60s is just daily practice of American diplomats, of the American State Department, or the U.S. President. I don't know how anyone can take this seriously at this point. And I'm not somebody who wants to sit here and curl about Trump and that he's the worst thing in the world. I think you guys know well enough that I've talked about these issues once again since 2018 that you can have a nuanced perspective on Trump, and that I think compared from his first term to his second term, Trump has slipped. And I do think a lot of that's effective age. I'm not saying he's undergoing any sort of cognitive decline per se, but I think he feels the pressures of the office on his head. He wants to cement his legacy, and because of the panic, he's doing all the wrong things. I think that is one of the reasons. Of course, there's also he is beholden to certain interests. But returning to the ultimate point of all of this, I said this last week. I'll say it again. It really is a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation when it comes to an American explanation for this. Because either we had good faith negotiations and we were browbeaten by a country of 9 million people into scrapping those negotiations and not only condoning but participating in their military campaign against the country that we're supposed to be negotiating with. Or worse, we went into these negotiations in completely bad faith, accused the Iranians of doing so in bad faith, and then launched a military campaign against them and supported another country's military campaign against them. Uh, I don't know how anyone can really look at an American diplomat at this point, look at the president, look at the Secretary of State, and think that, look, of course there's always going to be elements of subterfuge and distrust, and you can't really take anyone at their word. It's all a big prisoner's dilemma. I think we know that. But now it's blatant. There's no mistaking it. There's no air of, they might trust us for their own interest. This is a country that's just willing to throw everything to the wind when they get the right phone call from the right people. But returning to the question of regime change, it does make you wonder. Have they tried to assassinate Khamenei yet? Have those reports been true? Did the U.S. really veto that? And I do think it's well within the cards. I think the only reason they haven't so far, particularly the Israelis, is because they haven't been able to. They haven't been able to locate him, or he has escaped their attempts to assassinate him. But I do think it's on the table. I don't think it's something that they are really holding back on. And because I think if they had any concern about the ramifications of this operation, it would not have happened in the first place. What's the assassination of the head of state on top of all of this? Now, I don't think, and I could be proven wrong because I didn't think that before the Israeli strikes, I didn't think that the U.S. was going to ever engage in military action against the Iranians. But after the Israeli strikes, it did become an inevitability. It was a matter of when rather than if, especially after the Iranian retaliation. But assuming the Iranians don't retaliate against American military assets in the region, or there isn't a false flag where they quote-unquote retaliate against American military assets in the region, then I don't see the Americans carrying out this operation themselves. I could see them both condoning and abetting Israel carrying out such an operation, but as for the Americans themselves, I simply don't see them assassinating Khamenei. But the Israelis, absolutely. Which brings us to the other big question of what is going to happen with this, and that is the Strait of Hormuz. So to put up the map for context, this is the Strait of Hormuz right here. One of the most vital trade routes in the world, especially when it comes to energy trade. And that not only affects Iranian oil exports, but also the exports of the other Gulf states and Iraq as well. And the Iranian parliament has unanimously endorsed the idea of closing the straits. So some say it's only a matter of time before this happens. Some say expect it to be done as early as today. And I do think at this point, yeah, it probably is going to happen because they can tank the global oil market. And some of the common objections to this is, well, what about their oil trade, particularly with China? And why would China go along with this? Well, I think people overemphasize the amount of Iranian oil China imports because China's main energy supplier is, no surprise, the Russians. When it comes to oil and gas, they get that primarily from the Russians. But the other thing to consider with the Iran-Russia trade is the so-called Silk Road Railway. And you can see right here, it goes through Central Asia from China to Iran, which does explain a lot, particularly when it comes to the question of the Uyghurs. Look at where the terminus point is in China. It is in Xinjiang, or Uyghur-stan if you prefer. Crosses through the Central Asian nations, through Kyrgyzstan, through Kazakhstan, through Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, before entering into Iran. And they could conceivably transfer oil via tanker using this railway. And China would still be supplied via land. And that's been the goal of China's policy in Central Asia and the Middle East, is to undercut the need for reliance on the American-dominated seas to continue on with the trade by land, which we've seen with Russia, in order to solidify the Eurasian landmass. Once again, this has been talked about for years now. And like I said, you can look at the source on this. This goes all the way back to 2015. So this has been in the works for quite some time. And as far as current trade connections via land between Iran and China, I don't know how sophisticated they are in terms of energy transportation, but I would imagine that yes, that is something that is going to be something that they're going to account for, as well as possibility of pipeline construction. We could see further pipeline construction continue on, especially after the hostilities cease, through this Central Asian region into China. But even if Iran's sea trade were to become compromised, you still do have these land routes, which, like I said, have been in works for years. And as it stands now, with the question of support for Iran from Russia and China, the Iranians did reject a security guarantee similar to the one that North Korea had when it came to the negotiations of their strategic pact. But given the vitality, and we can talk about the north-south corridor for Russian trade into India via Iran, both countries have pretty vested economic interests in the survival of an Iranian government that would be cooperative with them, even if it is. And I'm spitballing here. I don't believe this, but even assuming there's some sort of regime change in Iran, you could see a scenario where whoever replaces the current government is still aligned with Russia and China for its economic reasons, and that still does continue these projects. But as it stands now, the Russians, the Chinese, I do not foresee them abandoning the Iranians because of how vital it is, especially the Russians. And I'm not making the argument that the Russians should, quote unquote, fight Iran's wars for them. I don't think that's even on the table right now. Because ultimately, you can't help a country that's going to not help itself. We saw this in Syria. But the Iranians are conducting their own military operations. They do seem to be competent in their own right. But as it stands now, in terms of funding, and maybe not so much armament, because you would run into a similar situation in Ukraine where you do have to train them on these armaments, etc., etc. While some might say that the Russians are getting cold feet on the Iranians, they'll throw them under the bus. Both in terms of trade interest, in terms of security interest, with Iran serving as a southern flank for Russia in many ways, I don't see that happening. And even though, as I was saying before, the Chinese get most of their oil from the Russians, they still receive quite a bit of their oil from the Iranians. That if all Iranian oil were to be cut off, it would be detrimental to the Chinese economy. It wouldn't be a death knell scenario, but it's not an ideal scenario either. Like I said, we'll see how much that can be mitigated via land trade, particularly with the rail networks and any future pipeline projects or any sort of transfer via Iran to Russia to China or some other third-party transit mode. That very well could be the case. But I do think when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, just to get this map up, the biggest losers in all of this, this isn't going to shock anyone, are going to be the Europeans. They have severed themselves from Russian gas, and it now looks like, because of conflict in the region, that access to energy resources from the Middle East are going to be cut off. And it's going to be bad enough in terms of international effect on the market when it comes to the price per barrel of oil. It could spike gas prices in the United States and energy costs in the United States as well, which would only exacerbate the current inflation and economic issues in the U.S. Going to the midterms, going into the 2028 election as well, which isn't going to reflect well on Trump. But ultimately, it's the Europeans, once again, who are the big losers in all of this when it comes to the question of economic and energy trade. They're the ones who are going to get absolutely screwed by this once again. That's assuming there isn't some sort of moment of clarity where they realize that détente with Russia is their best option when it comes to staying relevant globally and economically. that they need to put this Ukraine nonsense behind them, and that they stand to gain far more from some sort of, even just working relationship with Russia. I'm not even going to say good relationship, even some sort of working relationship with Russia, versus the alternative of the perpetual hostility. Uh, but I don't foresee that happening, barring, like I said, using this in an abstract term, not advocating anything, uh, regime change in Europe, if you will. Barring that, it's just simply not going to happen. But this whole topic does bring into question something I said back before the election in a video I made, because I know some of you, and I see some of you in the comments, like I said, you're fully within your rights to criticize me. I'm not, look, I'm not going to get mad or pissed off about this. I'm not sensitive about this. I do like to see what you guys have to say. That is part of the reason I do this, to have some sort of dialogue. And that is when I made the video back, I don't know, about a week before the election, where I did say, yeah, I'm voting for Trump. And yes, I did end up voting for Trump. And the question of regretting my vote, the question of reassessing it, the question of, am I a sucker, am I a fool, am I got conned? And I haven't rewatched that video, I don't think, since I really first put it out. But I do recall saying that, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. I'll retract these statements if I am wrong. That I didn't have high hopes for Trump, and I expected that I would be sharply critical of him going into a second term. But I did still think he was worth the chance on a number of issues, both in terms of domestic and foreign policy, more so domestic policy. But it does appear my hopes have been dashed. Now, I wanted to put off addressing this until the 6-month mark. I wanted to have at least half a year under Trump's second term before I really started making these sort of assessments. But because of how rapid-paced Trump's second term has been, I think it is worth addressing now. That being said, I'll return to comments I've said since that video, comments I said in the lead up to the election. In many ways, I think the regime wanted Trump because, number one, he would be pro-Israel enough to take these kind of actions, and number two, when the inevitable crises come to a head, say Ukraine, say Iran, say China, domestic issues, the economy, domestic issues, the crime, demographics, etc., Trump would fall on his own sword, and he would be left to take the blame for years, if not decades, of failed policy. Which, yes, considering his first term and even now his second term, he has played a part in that, but he's not solely responsible. But I do think in many ways they were setting him up to take the blame, to take the fall for a lot of these. And that the crises that would be set to befall America between 2025 and 2029, they wanted those had to have the MAGA flavor instead of the rainbow flag, DEI hire flavor. Now that we don't still have that, it's in the background. It's still there. A lot of the quote-unquote anti-woke push has been a mirage. I don't think anyone should be fooled by that, even if they have publicly put it away. But I do think, and it's happening at a much more rapid rate than I would have expected, that is coming to fruition. That we are seeing Trump fall on his own sword, and we are seeing his legacy be tarnished, and that he was allowed to return to office because of that. Now, there were some people who wanted to prevent that, as we saw with the multiple attempts on his life. Probably some well-connected elements that wanted to prevent that, but ultimately the regime, by and large, made its peace with Trump. Kamala was there to be the fall woman. Biden was also, I think, said would be the fall guy, that he'd been able to pass him off as somebody who at least had a bit of coherence left in him. And, like I said, I can't say I regret my decision because, and I don't want to sit here and defend Trump. I'm not trying to defend Trump in the slightest. But to reflect on my own position, what I said previously, back in November, if I could put it another way, under Harris, there was a 99% chance of something going wrong in these situations playing out. Maybe with a different flavor, maybe in a different sequence. Perhaps the flashpoint would have been Ukraine instead of Iran. Not that Iran was off the table. Versus, I guess what you could have said is a 98% 98% chance under Trump, just to put proverbial figures to it. Where there was just that slightest chance that, I don't know, Trump might do some things a little better, but it looks like continuity is too strong, and even Trump with his new sweeping changes to the American government, and he's going to get Doge, and he's going to eliminate USAID, and he's going to eliminate all of these different things and have a real radical restructuring of the American government. And it all turned out to be a farce. And mind you, we still have until January 2029 with this guy in office. And I said it at his 100-day mark, but it really did feel like a 100-day century. And what is this all going to feel like by 2029? What is this going to look at? Because we've had such rapid change. Will this start to calm down as we approach the midterms? Will everyone try to really get their ducks in a row and make things look sane and stable so they can win the slight majority of the electorate? Who knows? I can't presume to say. But in many ways, I think actions that cannot be undone have been taken. That we've gotten the ball rolling, and it's simply not going to stop. And that it will continue to spiral and spiral until we hit a point where we can't anymore. And what the ruins of that look like, I don't want to imagine. But I do think that we've reached a point of no return in many ways when it comes to the quote-unquote normalcy of American life. And that we're simply not going to get any relief from this anytime soon, barring some sort of major black swan event. But that's my general thoughts on the situation in Iran, and with all that being said, I will give a brief Ukraine update, and also talk about the implications of these current actions when it comes to the viability of Ukraine. So starting in the Sumy region, the yellow arrows represent attempted Ukrainian attacks that were repelled. There were attempted attacks on Tiokino, which is right there. That's the furthest west on the map. The southern point of Ryzhkevka and Besilovka, which is further to the east on the map. So there weren't too many Russian advances in Sumy over the past week, but there was a solidification of ground and repelling of Ukrainian attacks. Moving on to the Seversk front, we had clashes in Perezdovnoye, Vimka, Ivano-Deryevka, and also the Russians have taken Grigorivka, which is where you see the just the red arrow advancing towards Grigorivka. Moving on to Novopavlovka, right on the border of the Donetsk and Dnepropetrovsk Oblast. We had advances on Orakovo, Zaporozhye village, not to be confused with the city of Zaporozhye, in Zirka. Moving on to Kupiansk. You can see Kupiansk right there circled in the yellow. Fighting continues between Russian and Ukrainian forces in Figolivka, Orakovka, with the Russian capture of Dolzhenkoye, which is not labeled on the map, but it is the second northmost red arrow right there, the one not in Figolivka, with the red and the yellow arrows representing the Russians and the Ukrainians respectively. Also, the capture of what I find humorous, the village of Moskovka in the direction of Kupiansk. And finally, for the Pokrovsk-Mirograd front, we have fighting continues near Rusin Yar. We have Russian advances in Rozino, Novotoretskoye, Yablonevko, and Alexandrovo-Kalinovo. Alexandrovo-Kalinovo is not labeled, but it is the easternmost arrow on the map, near the red-orange dot right there. And on top of all of this, while progress on the front has been rather slow, there have been continued strikes across Ukraine. In fact, they even actually hit some of the air defense systems that were scheduled to be transferred to Israel. But in all of this, Zelensky is panicking. He's demanding another 40 billion. He fears for the worst. He hasn't outright said it, but he fears for the worst now that American focus has been shifted towards Israel, and that with this, if the Americans double down, if we double down on our campaign in Iran, if the Middle East continues to divert our attention, then unless the great rearmament program of Friedrich Merz not only works, but works within the next, I don't know, 6 months, then Ukraine is screwed. And perhaps this is the out that Trump has been looking for. Israel needs our help more. And while I don't think Ukraine will be cut off entirely in favor of Israel, we're going to see less and less support trickle in. When it comes to financial support, we'll probably see a lot of that. But when it comes to the material support, the actual weapons that they need, barring, once again, Friedrich Merz's rearmament program and Peter Pavel's ingenious plan for the 800,000 shells that the Ukrainians need, Ukraine will continue to degrade. And under those circumstances, you might get the scenario in which we see the AFU collapse this year, that the head of Ukrainian intelligence was talking about. The head of the Ukrainian military intelligence, that is, was talking about. Budanov, I apologize, his name slipped my mind for a moment, but that Budanov was talking about, even though I think it was a bit fear-mongering, but what looked like a war that might go into next summer could reach a much more rapid conclusion if we do get an American doubling down in the Middle East, and we don't get, I don't know, say, European troops deploying into Ukraine, which I think is off the table. Even if they did, the amount of resistance they could offer is simply not enough to stop the inevitable. It would just be a waste of lives and resources on the part of the Europeans. And especially now that it looks like the Istanbul talks are dead in the water, if Putin is serious, if the Russians' leadership can double down, especially in light of Operation Spiderweb, then Ukraine might have a much more favorable outcome than I think anyone would have thought possible. And perhaps I'm reading too much into this, perhaps the situation is too early, perhaps I'm speculating too much. But there is no conceivable way in which the American empire can support Israel and Ukraine at the same time when they're both involved in active wars, as well as maintain force projection in East Asia. The military capabilities are simply not there. And as a result of that, you probably will see more belligerent actions, because force projection and quote-unquote deterrence capabilities are being stretched thin. You will see more and more brazen attacks, probably like Operation Spiderweb, probably like the strikes we conducted on Iran, when we do sense weak points, because we are running out of options. And then the other dire situation is, what do Israeli air defense systems look like? Do we have the air defense systems to bail Israel out? Are we going to have American personnel actively involved in interception missions? We might. We did announce that after the first round of, or in the lead up to the first round of Iranian retaliations, that we would launch interception missions for Iranian strikes against Israel. But at a certain point, the American empire is going to have to pick and choose one or the other. And it looks like right now they're picking Israel. They're picking the sacred cow that is Israel, and confronting the Iranians, which has been a war 20, if not 30 or 40 years in the making. And as it stands now, what does Ukrainian resistance look like in the light of a drawdown of support? Because as it stands now, I believe the Biden-era aid is supposed to draw down in August. I don't foresee Congress authorizing that. I don't see Trump asking Congress to authorize that, especially now that they have the excuse of Iran on the table. And as much as I hate to say it, I do think that it will be a semi-sustained campaign. And even if there's not direct American involvement, Congress is going to choose Israel over Ukraine. It is that simple. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And what the fallout of, say, a Ukraine more or less cut off from American support entirely looks like is going to be interesting. Are we going to see the exception of the quote-unquote Istanbul Plus agreement? Are the Ukrainians going to cede the 4 Oblast plus Crimea and pledge neutrality? Or are we going to see the Russians push further and make stronger demands? Are we going to see, say, for example, a referendum in Sumy, or once the Russians say, let's say they push on the southern front into Nikolaev and maybe even Odessa at that point? Are we going to see more of these referenda? Are we going to see a referendum in Dnipropetrovsk? A lot of this is possible, and as we near the final stages of the staging ground for Pokrovsk, as it is, as we really reach the height of the Battle of Pokrovsk, which is probably going to happen into the summer, into the fall, and as Ukraine's last fortress fall, and as Russia really starts to poke its head into Dnipropetrovsk, we could see the demand of more territory, more demands out of Ukraine, um, if not the outright collapse of the regime in Kiev. Uh, like I said, perhaps I'm thinking too grand on this scale, but the implication of in America that is completely sidetracked from support from Ukraine, which it has fostered since 2014, since before 2014, as we discussed previously, many of the armament operations for Ukraine took place under the first Trump administration. So this 20-year project in the making is being thrown aside for a 40-year project in the making. And like I said, I think you could argue that Ukraine is a 20-year project in the making when you consider going all the way back to the 2004 Orange Revolution and the 2008 promise of NATO entry, the Bucharest summit. But a much more deep-seated rivalry, in which case they will dredge up everything from the hostage crisis to the Iranian anti-American chants, whatever, in order to justify this. Even if, like I said, it's not direct American involvement, even if it is us supporting Israel or helping Israel at least fend off the Iranian attacks. Ukraine is dead in the water, and there's really no two ways about it. I don't know how many different ways I can say this, but I think the $1 million question in that case is, does Europe double down on its anti-Russia policy in the event of a collapse of Ukraine, or do they seek some sort of tacit reconciliation? And also the question is, are the Americans able to continue the reconciliation with Russia, which seems like much of the effort for that on the part of the Americans has been suspended. The State Department made that an announcement to that effect last week. And it really does beg the question of, what is the American security situation? What is the American geopolitical situation going to look like in this? Are we seeing a genuine forced retraction of the American empire? Because this certainly isn't voluntary, but we've tied down ourselves on too many fronts, and something eventually has to give. And that's also on top of the massive blow American diplomatic credibility took just this past week. But that's really all I had for this episode. I apologize if there wasn't enough secondary information to cover. Maybe with some of the stuff out of Europe and the Asia Pacific, but of course the Iran news dominated the headlines, especially after last night. I'm glad I did put off making an episode to tonight to upload on Monday afternoon. But I will see you guys soon, and goodbye.